History's most important wedding ended not with the consummation of a marriage, but with the synchronized death rattle of an entire generation of European nobility, their bodies convulsing on the stone floors of a grand ballroom. This is the story of the Wedding of Dijon, a tale so horrific and so politically devastating that official histories have tried to bury it under the sanitized label of pestilence, while the whispers in the margins of court records call it by its true name, the Dijon Curse. In the turbulent mid-14th century, Europe was a fractured chessboard of warring kingdoms, where alliances were as fragile as glass and royal blood was the ink used to sign treaties. To end decades of simmering conflict over territory and trade routes, a marriage of monumental significance was arranged. Princess Isabella of Castile, a young woman known for her intelligence and celebrated beauty, was to be wed to Prince Tierry of Burgundy, a formidable young prince whose domain was a rising power between France and the Holy Roman Empire. This was no simple union. It was a political earthquake. It promised to create a powerful Castilian-Burgundian axis that would dominate Western Europe, shifting the balance of power and threatening the ambitions of rival kingdoms from the sun-baked courts of Aragon to the hallowed halls of Paris. To witness how this promise of peace curdled into an unparalleled act of mass murder, make sure you subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell. Because what happened in Dijon is a terrifying lesson in how quickly a celebration of life can become a festival of death. The wedding took place at the magnificent ducal palace of Dijon, a fortress of power that had been transformed into a theater of opulence for the occasion. For a full week, the celebrations raged, a spectacle of wealth and power designed to awe the 400 noble guests who had traveled from across the continent. This was the political and social elite of Europe, a glittering assembly of dukes, counts, barons, and bishops, their family crests hanging from the rafters like a forest of heraldic banners. The banquet tables groaned under the weight of a feast designed to showcase Burgundy's immense wealth. There were roasted peacocks, redressed in their own shimmering feathers, entire boars stuffed with spiced meats, and towers of candied fruits and delicate pastries imported at enormous expense from the famed confectioners of Sicily. The wine, a deep Burgundian red, flowed from silver fountains, its endless supply a testament to the host's seemingly infinite resources. Behind the scenes, the kitchens were a hive of activity, with an army of cooks, butchers, and bakers working around the clock under the watchful eye of the Duke's master of ceremonies. Security, it seemed, was ironclad. The palace gates were manned by veteran Burgundian knights, the halls were patrolled by armed guards, and every servant had been vetted for loyalty. But beyond the walls of Dijon, the union was being watched with envy and fear. The rival kingdoms of Navarre and Aragon, whose own ambitions in the Iberian Peninsula were directly threatened by a strengthened Castile, saw the wedding not as a celebration, but as a declaration of war. In Paris, the French crown looked upon the rising power of its vassal, the Duke of Burgundy, with growing unease. A Burgundy tied to the might of Castile was a Burgundy that could no longer be easily controlled. Envoys and spies from these rival courts moved among the guests, their smiles hiding daggers of political calculation. They observed the lavish displays, noted the key alliances being formed in quiet conversations, and sent coded messages back to their masters. Inside the palace, however, the mood was one of triumphant celebration. Musicians played lively tunes on lutes and viols, dancers filled the great hall with color and motion, and priests delivered lengthy blessings, praising the union as a gift from God destined to bring an era of peace and prosperity. As Princess Isabella and Prince Tierry exchanged their vows before the high altar, no one could have known that they were not sealing a dynastic future, but presiding over its spectacular and horrific funeral. The final night of the week-long celebration was to be the grandest of all. It was the culmination of the festivities, a final, magnificent banquet to honor the newly married couple. The great hall was ablaze with the light of 1,000 candles, their flames dancing off the jewels and silks of the assembled nobility. The mood was ecstatic. The political maneuvering was done, the treaties were symbolically sealed, and all that was left was to drink to the future of the new dynasty. As the feast reached its crescendo, a special course was served, delicate, honey-drenched pastries accompanied by a rare, sweet dessert wine, a prized vintage served in exquisite crystal goblets. A herald announced a final toast to the health, fertility, and long life of Prince Tierry and Princess Isabella. The great nobles of Europe rose to their feet, a sea of smiling faces, and raised their glasses. The toast was made, the wine was drunk, and for a fleeting moment, the promise of a golden age seemed to hang in the air. Then, the screaming began. It started with a single guest, a powerful German baron who clutched his throat, his face contorting in a mask of confusion and pain before he collapsed. Then another, a Castilian countess, began to vomit uncontrollably, her fine silk gown ruined. Within minutes, the scene descended from a royal banquet into a Boschian hellscape. Nobles across the hall began to seize, their bodies racked with violent convulsions. The air filled with the sounds of choking, retching, and the sickening thud of bodies hitting the stone floor. Panic erupted. Guards and servants, who seemed completely unharmed, rushed forward, but there was nothing they could do. The poison was devastatingly fast and brutally effective. Princess Isabella, the beautiful young bride, was among the first to die, her life ending in a violent, 3-hour agony. Prince Tierry, her new husband, lingered through the night, his strong body ravaged by the poison, before finally succumbing the following morning. By dawn, the great hall was a charnel house. The tapestries were spattered with vomit and blood. The uneaten feast lay cold on the tables, and the floors were littered with the corpses of Europe's elite. Nearly 24 noble houses, from the grandest duchies to the smallest baronies, had lost their heirs in a single night. The dynastic union that was meant to secure peace had in one horrific toast wiped out an entire generation of nobility and plunged the continent into a new era of terror. The news of the Dijon wedding massacre sent a shockwave of horror and paranoia through every court in Europe. The event was so catastrophic, so perfectly targeted, that it defied immediate explanation. The official cause of death, hastily announced by the grief-stricken and terrified Burgundian court, was a sudden and virulent pestilence, a convenient fiction that explained the rapid deaths while avoiding the politically explosive truth of mass assassination. No one was ever formally arrested, no trial was ever held, but behind the scenes, the whispers began immediately, and a list of powerful suspects quickly took shape. The most prominent suspect was Henry of Trastamara, the ruthless and ambitious half-uncle of Princess Isabella. Henry was locked in a brutal civil war for the throne of Castile, and Isabella's marriage to the powerful Prince of Burgundy represented a grave threat to his claim. Her death, and more importantly, the prevention of her producing a legitimate heir with Tierry, directly and immediately benefited his cause. He had the motive, and his reputation for ruthless political calculation made him a prime candidate. Suspicion also fell upon the rival kingdoms of Aragon and Navarre. Their agents had been present at the wedding, and the collapse of the Castilian-Burgundian alliance was a massive strategic victory for them. They had a long history of using espionage and assassination as tools of statecraft, and the targeted nature of the poisoning sparing the servants and guards while eliminating the nobility pointed to a level of sophistication that only a state-sponsored intelligence operation could possess. The Dijon massacre was not just a human tragedy, it was a political cataclysm that reshaped the map of Europe. The immediate effect was the total collapse of Burgundy's political will. The Duke, consumed by grief and paranoia, withdrew his court from the world, abandoning all foreign ambitions to focus on internal security. The nascent alliance with Castile was dead, and with it, any opposition to Henry of Trastamara's faction. With Isabella and her potential heirs eliminated, Henry swiftly consolidated his power, winning the Castilian Civil War and establishing a new dynasty that would rule for centuries. The territories that were supposed to have been united under Isabella and Tierry became festering sores of conflict. The lack of a clear line of succession in Burgundy, and in the dozens of other noble houses that lost their heirs at the wedding, triggered a series of bitter and bloody succession wars that would plague France and the Iberian Peninsula for a generation. Powerful families that had endured for centuries were wiped out overnight, their lands and titles devoured by opportunistic rivals. A new age of instability and paranoia began. The trust that had once bound the European nobility, a shared code of conduct even in times of war, was shattered. The wedding, traditionally a sacred space of truce and celebration, had been turned into a weapon of mass destruction. Kings and dukes who had once feasted at each other's tables now looked upon one another with deep suspicion. Alliances became fragile. Treaties were signed with a sense of dread, and the very act of diplomacy was fraught with peril. The political landscape of the 14th century was irrevocably altered. The rise of the Trastamaras in Spain, the temporary crippling of Burgundian power, and the ensuing power vacuum in several key regions can all be traced back to that single, poisoned toast. The assassins, whoever they were, had not just killed a few dozen people. They had killed an era of possibility and plunged Europe into a new cycle of violence, suspicion, and war, all born from the ashes of a feast that was meant to celebrate peace. The psychological impact of the Dijon massacre resonated far beyond the realm of politics. In a deeply religious age, an event of such unprecedented horror was inevitably interpreted through the lens of divine will. The Church, struggling to explain how God could have allowed such an atrocity to occur at a blessed union, declared the event either an act of divine punishment for the sins and decadence of the nobility, or a terrifying act of devilish infiltration into the heart of Christendom. Preachers delivered fire and brimstone sermons, warning that the poison was a physical manifestation of the moral corruption that festered in the hearts of the powerful. This framing only amplified the terror, adding a layer of supernatural dread to the political paranoia. The ducal palace of Dijon itself became a place of profound horror. It was abandoned for nearly a generation, its grand halls left to gather dust. Surviving courtiers and local peasants reported hearing the ghostly screams of the victims echoing through the empty corridors at night. The site became a monument to the tragedy, a place so saturated with grief and terror that it was believed to be permanently haunted, cursed by the spirits of the murdered nobility. The tragedy also birthed an era of intense culinary paranoia that swept through every royal court in Europe. The feast, once a symbol of trust and hospitality, was now seen as a potential death trap. The role of the food taster, previously a minor ceremonial position, became one of the most important and dangerous jobs in any royal household. Elaborate rituals were developed to ensure the safety of the monarch's food. Kitchens were placed under armed guard and locked down, with only a few trusted individuals allowed inside. Every ingredient was scrutinized, every dish prepared under watchful eyes. Forensic wine rituals became the norm, with a designated taster sampling not just the wine in the decanter, but the wine from the king's own cup, moments before he drank. Amidst the horror, a single figure of hope and mystery emerged. Lady Agnes d'Auvergne, a Castilian noblewoman who had attended the feast but, for some unknown reason, had not drunk the poisoned wine. She became known as La Miracule, the miraculous one. Legends swirled around her. Some said she had been warned by a divine vision, others that a loyal servant had secretly switched her goblet. She became a semi-mythic figure, a symbol of divine providence and survival, her story told and retold in poems and songs as a small flicker of light in an overwhelming darkness. In the end, no justice was ever served for the victims of the Dijon wedding. The political cost of a formal investigation was deemed too high. To officially accuse a rival king or a powerful faction of mass murder would have triggered an all-out war that no one could afford. And so, a conspiracy of silence descended. Key records were altered or lost. Witnesses were quietly silenced or disappeared. The official narrative of a tragic pestilence was maintained, a convenient lie that allowed the European powers to move on, even as the open wound of the massacre continued to fester. The event passed from history into the realm of myth, its true details obscured by centuries of fear and deliberate obfuscation. It became known in the hushed tones of court historians simply as the Dijon curse. Yet, the story's influence was undeniable. It inspired a generation of dark and cautionary plays, operas, and allegorical poems throughout Europe, all exploring themes of betrayal, poison, and the deadly nature of power. In a more practical sense, the tragedy forced a profound change in the nature of royal security and diplomacy. The safety of a monarch at a foreign court could no longer be taken for granted. Diplomatic security became a professionalized field, with advanced teams scouting locations and highly trained bodyguards replacing ceremonial retainers. The fear of death by alliance also led many royal families to turn inward, preferring to arrange marriages between cousins and other close relatives rather than risk the dangers of a foreign court. This practice of dynastic inbreeding would have its own disastrous long-term consequences, but it was born from the terror instilled by the events at Dijon. Some scholars even cite the massacre as a catalyst for the development of early toxicology, as physicians and alchemists began to more systematically study the nature of poisons in an attempt to find antidotes. The legacy of the Dijon curse is a powerful reminder that sometimes the most influential historical events are not the ones that are celebrated with monuments, but the ones that are buried in silence. It teaches us that trust, once shattered on such a grand scale, can take centuries to rebuild, and that the fear of a poisoned cup can change the course of history as surely as any great battle.